The rain had been tapping on the roofs of Harbourbridge since late afternoon, the kind of Atlantic storm that turned the lanes into ribbons of slate. In a one-bed terrace near the river wall, Nora Carter, 32, kept a notebook open beside a chipped mug of tea. Numbers sat there like unwelcome guests. Overdue rent, a final notice, the school trip already marked with a red cross. She told herself it would be fine, that spring would come, and the cafe would be busy again. Still, the figures didn't move when she blinked. Maya slept on the sofa under a knitted throw from Nora's Nan, a bright thing in a room lined with second-hand books. When money was thin, Nora traced ferry routes with her finger. She worked breakfast at a harbor cafe and cleaned at the clinic when hours appeared, but winter had slowed everything. The cafe cut staff. She had stretched meals and schedules until both felt threadbare. A small cross of beechwood rested on the mantel. Nora didn't think of herself as religious, not really, but on nights like this she let thoughts drift upward. Please keep us afloat. The second thought arrived uninvited and softer. It would be good not to carry all of this alone. Not a wish for rescue, more a wish for company when letters pushed through the door with red print and leaflets she could not afford to read. Outside, wind shouldered the river and rain pinned itself to the glass. Sirens rose toward the estuary. On the local radio, a calm voice mentioned a flood warning, high tide at midnight, sandbags at the council depot. Nora checked the towel she had pressed along the back door. A thin line of water glimmered there anyway. She slid the bills into the notebook and sat on the sofa with Maya's warm feet in her lap. If morning came dry, she would ring the school about the trip and ask for extra hours at the clinic. If morning did not come dry, she would lift the rug, move the books, and hope the river remembered how to stay in its bed. For now, she let the kettle sing, a small anchor in a house that felt suddenly very light, as if it could float. By midnight the wind had hardened from warning to command. The council van crawled along the quay, hazard lights blinking through rain that now moved as if driven by a single hand. The river, swollen by upstream rain and spring tide, pressed its brown shoulder against the wall and climbed. Nora pulled on her old parka and wrapped Maya in layers, moving with the practiced calm of someone who had learned not to alarm a child more than the sirens already did. She tucked the beechwood cross into a pocket, not as magic, simply as habit, then lifted the rug, wedged the books on high shelves, and slung their small rucksack over her shoulder. When the first cold sheet slid under the back door, she decided the house could fend for itself for a few hours. The council had opened the leisure center as a rest point. To get there, they would have to cut across the square and follow the higher lane. She told Maya they were going on a midnight adventure. The girl, half asleep and brave in the way children are when they copy a parent's face, nodded and clutched the torch. Outside, the air tasted of metal. Bins had toppled like chess pieces. Somewhere an alarm contended with the wind and lost. They were nearly at the square when the river found the first shortcut. Water rolled past the fishmongers and curled around the postbox, taking on the grim purpose of an animal that had mapped the town all its life. Nora judged the depth and waited. Maya, perched on her hip, made herself small and serious. A figure in a high-vis jacket moved out of the gloom, hand raised with the reassurance of authority. Not a halt, but a here. He was tall, mud to the knee, with a laminated map crumpled in one hand and a radio pressed to his shoulder. He had the unflustered look of someone trained to stand still in a storm. He introduced himself as Elliot Ward, with a tilt of the head rather than words. His mouth moved, but the wind took most of it, then guided them up onto the church steps where the water ran thinner. He checked Maya's face for color, scanning with the brisk tenderness of a paramedic, though his badge read something else. Resilience officer. He pointed toward the leisure center and, with a pencil stabbed through the map, marked a safer backway. He also pointed to the sandbag depot behind the council offices, a makeshift mountain of Hessian under tarpaulins, and to a notice board where volunteers were writing house numbers and needs in thick marker. She felt the gentle insistence of the moment. He was not just moving them along, he was drafting them into a pattern that made sense. On the square, the cafe owner wrestled with a stack of chairs against his door. Nora handed Maya the torch and stepped to shoulder the weight with him. The two pushed together, arms straining, until the chairs wedged tight. Elliot braced the bottom with a sandbag that had appeared as if summoned, then held up his radio and listened. His gaze kept returning to the river, not in fear, but in calculation, like a chess player watching a clock. He asked, by gesture, by the tilt of his eyebrows. If Nora knew the residents in the mix of flats above the shops. She did. In minutes, she found herself knocking on doors with a volunteer list in her hand, confirming who had left and who might still be asleep, who needed help, who had medication to grab. On the third door, an elderly woman named Mrs. Doyle answered with the stubborn dignity of someone who had weathered more winters than the rest of them combined. She had been waiting for a son who worked nights on the road. The water was at her ankle now, and rising. Nora weighed the options, and found that there were few. The stairwell was a funnel, the lift was out, and the sun was an hour away if roads held. Elliot was already there, as if he had read her thoughts, showing how to strap the woman's overnight bag across his back to leave both hands free. He suggested the old fire escape at the rear, which the woman had not used in 10 years. The iron groaned but held. Nora steadied the railing and set the pace. Elliot took the weight and kept the rhythm of each careful step, as if counting out a dance. By the time they reached the lane, the water in the square had joined hands with the stream that usually minded its own business by the park. The two moved as one, confident in an ancient right. At the leisure center, light and echoes replaced darkness and sirens. Volunteers moved like patient ants, laying out blankets, labeling tables with thick pens, tea, chargers, first aid, spare coats. The smell of instant coffee arrived as a small mercy. Elliot conferred with the center manager and passed Nora a folded leaflet about emergency funds and a number scrawled on it. A micro-grant scheme for small-town workers in disrupted trades. She tucked it beside the cross and felt that curious mixture of relief and resistance that comes when help is offered in public. He, sensing this without making a point of it, turned to a whiteboard and wrote clear instructions for anyone arriving after, the letters straight even with cold hands. It was there, between a table of donated wellies and a stack of soft toys, that the shape of the night changed. A second team radioed in. 2 streets south, a culvert had backed up, and the water would likely take the bakery and the bookshop if the blockage wasn't cleared. Elliot scanned the room for bodies to move, then looked at Nora, not out of convenience, but because he had already seen what she was like when asked. He held up a pair of gloves and a torch, then sketched the plan with quick lines in the air. 4 people, a rope, clear the grate, let the river find its course again. He would take the rope end. Would she help? Nora glanced at Maya, who was now molding a soft toy into a bed on a folded coat. The girl looked up with the solemn trust children give to a parent's decision. In that moment, the choice arranged itself in Nora's chest with a clarity she recognized from other hard nights. The house could wait. The ledger of bills and hopes could wait. What could not wait was the thing in front of her and the person she was when the thing arrived. She nodded once. Elliot didn't smile exactly. His face shifted into a relief that looked a lot like respect. The catalyst was not the storm or the siren or the map. It was the way a stranger's outstretched hand fit the shape of her own. They moved back into the rain with a small squad. The cafe owner, a college student who had been charging phones, a postal worker still in royal blue fleece. The rope went around Elliot's waist and through the hands of the others. Nora took the second position, the one that lent strength without being showy. The culvert roared like an animal with a blocked throat. She felt the road through her boots, felt the river's impatience, felt at last the anchor she had missed earlier. Not the kettle or the cross, but purpose. When the grate finally gave and the water rushed in on its proper path, the town seemed to take a breath with her. Back at the center, dripping and exhausted, she watched Maya share crisps with another child and thought how swiftly a life could widen in a night that had begun as pure threat. Elliot handed her a card with his name printed small and an email that looked official, but not remote. He mentioned, quietly, as if offering a spare glove rather than a promise, that there might be temporary work with the recovery team. Someone local needed to coordinate volunteers and small grants. She didn't say yes. She didn't say anything. But a door she had not known was there had opened, and behind it, there was light. Morning arrived not with sunshine, but with a tired, watery glow. The river had receded just enough to reveal its trail of mud and debris, a reminder of how quickly order could be undone. Nora sat on a folding chair near the leisure center entrance, sipping from a paper cup of coffee that tasted faintly of cardboard, but warmed her hands. She watched as families trickled out, some returning to homes spared by the tide, others heading toward relatives' houses, their bags heavy with whatever they had managed to rescue. Maya had found a new friend in the form of a curly-haired boy with a toy truck. The two drove it noisily along the grooves of the tiled floor, their laughter piercing through the weary hush of the adults. For a moment, Nora allowed herself to lean back and breathe. She had not slept. Not really, but her exhaustion carried an odd buoyancy. There had been no time to sink under worry. The night had demanded action, and action had given her something sturdier than fear. Elliot appeared mid-morning, his high-vis jacket still damp, but his step steady. He carried a clipboard now, and the sight of it reminded Nora that, beyond the chaos, there was structure forming. Lists, records, accountability. He crouched beside the children, asked them if the truck could manage the mountains of scattered blankets, and smiled faintly when they obliged. Then he stood and turned to Nora with a look that balanced official and personal. He explained that the recovery phase had begun. Assessments were needed, people registered for aid, volunteers coordinated for cleanup. Local knowledge was invaluable, he said, and few knew the town as well as its own residents. His words were measured, but there was weight behind them. She could hear the unspoken part. She had already proven herself capable in the night. Nora hesitated. Her life was full of fragile balances, shifts at the cafe, cleaning work, caring for Maya, and the constant arithmetic of bills. Adding more to her plate seemed reckless, yet the thought of stepping back, of returning to her narrow routine while others rebuilt the town around her, pressed uneasily against her chest. By noon, she had accepted. Elliot placed her on a rota with the title, Community Liaison. It sounded bigger than what she imagined she could manage, yet the words steadied her. She would act as a bridge between residents and officials, listening to what people needed, relaying information, helping cut through the fog of bureaucracy. Her first task came almost immediately. An elderly couple had refused to leave their cottage by the old mill, afraid of looters. Elliot asked if she might accompany him to check on them. They walked together through lanes still slick with silt, the town bearing a bruised look. Shutters bent, bins overturned, shop windows smeared with mud. Every so often, Elliot paused to note damages, his eyes sharp, his movements calm. At the cottage, the couple greeted them with suspicion, but Nora's familiar face softened their stance. She spoke gently, reminding them of the risks, explaining the support available. Eventually, they agreed to relocate temporarily, reassured more by her tone than Elliot's official assurances. Watching the way Elliot observed this exchange, his quiet nod, his glance of appreciation, Nora realized he understood the value of trust. Over the next days, her role deepened. She found herself mapping houses in need of food deliveries, organizing a group of teenagers to clear debris from the park, and translating the jargon of council forms into plain language for neighbors who had never filled one out. Each time she doubted her capacity, someone's relieved smile or simple thank you steadied her resolve. At night, when Maya slept curled beneath donated blankets, Nora walked the perimeter of the leisure center or sat by the river's edge. The water looked calmer now, almost penitent, as if ashamed of its violence. She thought of the cross in her pocket, the one she had carried without much faith, and wondered if its meaning had shifted. Not a plea to the heavens, perhaps, but a reminder of resilience rooted in community. Her connection with Elliot, too, grew in the silences between tasks. They rarely spoke of personal lives. His focus remained on logistics, hers on survival, but there was a current of recognition between them. He had seen her wade into chaos without asking for credit. She had seen him lead without arrogance, respecting the voices of those who had the least power. One evening, as they logged damages in the square, Elliot told her about his own past, years of working disaster zones abroad, always leaving before the recovery was complete. "You learn to move on fast," he said, his eyes on the mud-stained pavement. Nora wondered if that was a confession or a warning. She didn't reply directly. Instead, she told him about the cafe, about the struggle to keep things afloat, about Maya's dream of seeing the sea lions at the wildlife park. He listened, not with the distracted courtesy of someone half-occupied, but with a focus that suggested he understood how small hopes could be as vital as sandbags. It was in that exchange that something unspoken took root, fragile but undeniable. Both knew it was too early to name. The storm had given them a bond forged in urgency. What would remain when the waters fully receded was a question neither dared to answer yet. But for the first time in many winters, Nora felt the stirrings of possibility, like the faintest break of blue behind storm clouds. The following week unfolded like a series of tests. Harbourbridge had always been a modest town, its rhythm tied to the tides, but now it was forced to confront the fragility of its foundations. Streets once busy with chatter and shop signs were lined with stacked furniture, sodden carpets, and the acrid smell of disinfectant. Volunteers in mismatched boots moved like soldiers of goodwill, while clipboards and cameras documented the damage. Nora's work as community liaison became heavier each day. She rose early, sometimes before Maya woke, and walked to the council hub where Elliot and the team gathered. Her assignments ranged from simple tasks, delivering bottled water, distributing leaflets about hygiene, to more demanding ones, like calming residents furious at the insurance delays, or translating bureaucratic language into something they could accept without despair. One morning, a young mother named Rachel clutched Nora's sleeve, voice trembling as she explained how the flood had destroyed not just her flat, but her child's medication. Nora listened, steadying her tone, promising to get answers. She hurried back to Elliot, who made a quick call to the medical center and secured an emergency supply. The gratitude in Rachel's eyes lingered with Nora long after, reminding her why she endured the exhaustion. Meanwhile, her bond with Elliot evolved. They often worked side by side, walking muddy lanes, crossing lists off clipboards, and sharing those long silences that come when two people labor toward the same goal. His calm presence balanced her restless energy. He didn't offer her pity, nor did he expect her to admire him. He simply trusted her judgment, which was rarer than any kindness she had known in recent years. Late one evening, after a full day of organizing volunteers to clear the community hall, they sat on the steps outside, watching the last truck rumble away. Elliot leaned against the railing, his jacket spattered with mud, his voice low. "You're doing more than some paid officers," he remarked, not as flattery but as fact. Nora shook her head, brushing hair from her damp forehead. "I'm just here. If I stop moving, everything catches up with me." She thought of bills hidden in her notebook, of the cafe barely surviving, of the way Maya deserved more than patchwork solutions. Elliot didn't press. He only said, "Sometimes showing up is the hardest part." His words echoed in her mind for days. She noticed how he rarely spoke about himself unless prompted. There were hints, a scar along his hand, the faint weariness in his eyes, that suggested years of stories left untold. But she respected the boundaries, grateful that he gave her space without demanding confessions. Their work led them to corners of the town she had never seen closely before. The old shipyard, where abandoned cranes loomed like rusted skeletons, now housed volunteers distributing hot meals. The railway arches, long neglected, had become storage for relief supplies. Nora marveled at how crisis reconfigured everything. Spaces once forgotten now pulsed with new purpose. Still, strain accumulated. One afternoon, she returned to the leisure center to find Maya coughing from the damp air. Panic tightened her chest. She wrapped her daughter in layers and sat by her side through the night, guilt gnawing at her for stretching herself too thin. Elliot noticed the next morning. Without a word, he arranged for a temporary relocation to a friend's guest house on higher ground, a place warm and dry where children could breathe easier. Nora resisted at first. Accepting felt like admitting weakness, but eventually agreed. That evening, while Maya slept peacefully in the clean sheets of the guest house, Nora stood by the window and looked down over the town. The lights shimmered against puddles, and in that quiet moment, she admitted to herself how different things had become. She was no longer merely surviving storms. She was shaping the recovery, giving voice to those who might have been overlooked. The more she gave, the more she felt the weight of her own unspoken fears. What if this fragile stability collapsed when the volunteers left and the cameras turned away? What if Elliot, like he hinted, moved on to another town, another disaster, leaving her with nothing but memories of a bond forged in crisis? These questions haunted her, even as she carried on with determination. And yet, beneath the fatigue and doubt, something within her shifted. For the first time in years, Nora began to imagine not just enduring the days ahead, but building something out of them, something lasting. It was that flicker of hope, fragile as it was, that became her quiet strength. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew Elliot sensed it too. Their paths, once parallel but separate, were beginning to weave together in ways neither had planned. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. Weeks later, Harbourbridge bore the scars of the flood: cracked pavements, shuttered shops, and houses with pale rectangles on walls where photographs had once hung. Nora walked these streets daily, clipboard in hand, mapping needs and progress, her boots marked with dried mud that never fully washed away. At first, she had been buoyed by the purpose of the work, but slowly, as official promises stalled and resources thinned, a different weight pressed in. The microgrants were delayed, insurance claims tangled in bureaucracy, and tempers grew sharper. Residents who once thanked her now demanded answers she didn't have. "What good is your clipboard if it can't bring my home back?" one man barked, and the words stuck like splinters. Elliot remained steady, but even his calm began to fray. She caught him once, head bowed over a pile of forms, jaw clenched tight, the weariness etched deeper than usual. He was trained for emergencies, for chaos in the heat of crisis. But this slow, grinding recovery tested patience in ways adrenaline never could. One evening, Nora returned to the guest house to find Maya coughing again. The dampness clung to her chest, and the doctor advised rest, warmth, and stability. 3 things Nora could not guarantee. The guilt landed heavy. Was she failing as a mother by stretching herself so thin for the town? Would Maya remember her as the mother who comforted her through storms, or the one who left her with strangers while chasing after community duties? The doubt grew louder when she overheard Elliot on a late-night call. His voice, though muffled, carried phrases that cut sharp. Next deployment, temporary posting, can't stay indefinitely. She froze outside the room, her pulse rising. He had always been a man in motion, built for moving from disaster to disaster, but she had allowed herself to believe, foolishly perhaps, that Harbourbridge might tether him. That night, lying beside Maya, Nora could not sleep. She turned the thoughts over like stones in her hand. The unpaid rent, the fragility of work at the cafe, the mounting exhaustion. Elliot had become not just an anchor in the crisis, but a mirror of her own strength. The idea of him leaving felt like the flood all over again, another force stripping away what she had built. The following morning brought a test of a different kind. Word spread that the old mill dam upriver had been compromised. Engineers had raised alarms. A section of stone, weakened by weeks of saturation, could collapse with the next heavy rainfall. If that happened, the surge would sweep through the lower half of town, destroying much of what little had been restored. Emergency meetings flared. Elliot convened volunteers, his tone brisk but heavy. Sandbags would not be enough this time. Evacuation plans were drafted, shelters reopened, but fear moved faster than preparation. Families began packing cars, shopkeepers boarded up once again, and the uneasy sense that all their effort might be undone sank into everyone's bones. Nora stood in the hall as Elliot spread maps across a table. His finger traced the river's curve, the vulnerable streets, the evacuation routes. She recognized the look in his eyes, the calm mask of someone calculating risks too big for comfort. Yet when he looked at her, she saw the flicker of hesitation. He needed people he could rely on, but asking her meant pulling her deeper into danger. "Stay here with Maya," he told her finally, voice low, but she shook her head. "If I don't help now, what have all the weeks meant?" It was not defiance, but truth. She had been part of the town's recovery, trusted by neighbors, depended on in ways she never imagined. Walking away now would betray not just them, but herself. Elliot said nothing more. He simply placed a copy of the map into her hands. That night, as the town braced for another storm, Nora felt her doubt sharpen into a choice: remain safe with her daughter, or step once again into the uncertain current of responsibility. Both paths carried guilt. Both carried risk. The storm clouds thickened, and with them, so did the silence between what she feared and what she knew she must do. The rain came in sheets, relentless, hammering the rooftops and turning gutters into rivers. Sirens wailed again, a grim echo of that first night when the town had nearly drowned. But this time the fear was sharper, heavier, because they all knew what hung in the balance: the mill dam. If it failed, Harbourbridge would be cut in half by a wall of water. Nora stood in the command hall beside Elliot. The map spread wide under lantern light. The dam was old, its stones worn by centuries of flow, and the engineers were unsure whether temporary reinforcement would hold. Volunteers scrambled for equipment, Ropes, timber, sandbags, even broken doors to use as barriers. Elliot's orders were brisk, his tone steady, but Nora could sense the tension coiling beneath. This was not a battle they could fully win, only endure. She had left Maya in the care of Mrs. Doyle at the guest house, whispering a promise that she would be back before dawn. The look in her daughter's eyes, half trust and half fear, lingered in her chest like a weight. Every step away from her felt like betrayal, yet every step into the storm reminded her why she could not turn back. At the dam, the roar of water was deafening. Torrents spilled through cracks, frothing white, while the weakened section trembled under the force. Elliot tied the safety line around his waist, then handed the rope to Nora. "Your anchor," he shouted above the thunder. "If I slip, you hold." She gripped the rope, knuckles white. Watching him edge along the slick stones with a flood lamp strapped to his chest was like watching a figure walk into the mouth of something vast and hungry. Volunteers passed sandbags in a chain, dropping them where water forced its way through. Nora braced herself against the pull, feet digging into mud, every muscle taut. Minutes stretched into hours. Twice, Elliot lost his footing, and both times the rope snapped tight, jerking Nora forward with a violence that burned her palms. Each time, she steadied, refusing to let the line go. Around them, the storm howled like a living thing, determined to break stone, rope, and will alike. At last, with the final sandbags wedged, the flow slowed. The dam shuddered but held. Engineers gave no promises, only cautious nods. It might last the night, or it might not. But for now, Harbourbridge had been spared. Exhausted, soaked and shaking, Nora sat on the embankment, the rope still wrapped around her hands. Elliot lowered himself beside her. Mud streaked across his face. For a long moment, they said nothing. The silence was heavy, not with defeat, but with the knowledge of how close they had come to it. Then he turned to her. "I shouldn't have let you take this risk," he said, voice raw. "You didn't let me," she answered quietly. "I chose it." The words hung between them, more than an argument, an admission. In that instant, she realized what frightened her most wasn't the flood, or even the dam's fragile hold. It was the knowledge that she was tethered now, not just to her daughter, not just to the town, but to him. And if he left, as he surely would, she would feel the absence as keenly as the tide pulling out to sea. When the storm eased toward dawn, Elliot escorted her back to the guest house. Maya was asleep, safe, her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm Nora craved for herself. Elliot lingered at the doorway, as if words pressed behind his lips but would not surface. Finally, he said only, "We'll see what tomorrow brings." But in his eyes, Nora read the truth. Tomorrow might scatter them as easily as floodwater scatters debris. The test was not only the dam, nor the storm. It was the choice that loomed over them both, whether to hold on or to let the current take them elsewhere. Dawn broke with a fragile quiet, the kind that made the whole town pause before trusting it. The storm had passed, the dam had held, and Harbourbridge still stood, scarred but unbroken. Streets glistened with puddles, and the air carried that sharp scent of earth washed clean. For the first time in weeks, no sirens cut the silence. Nora walked through the square with Maya's small hand in hers. Shops reopened their doors, cautious but hopeful. Children chased each other between sandbag stacks, their laughter stitching color back into the gray morning. People greeted her with nods, some with brief embraces, their gratitude unspoken but heavy with meaning. She wasn't just the cafe worker anymore, or the mother struggling with bills. She had become, in their eyes, someone who had helped steady the town. At the leisure center, volunteers packed away blankets, folded tables, and stacked crates for storage. Elliot stood at the edge, clipboard in hand, already half-turned toward the future. His posting was ending. Another town, another storm awaited him. Nora felt it before he spoke, the inevitable pull of his life elsewhere. When he finally approached, there was no speech, no grand farewell, just a quiet honesty. "You won't need me here much longer. You've built something I couldn't." Nora swallowed, the truth sitting sharp in her chest. "I didn't build it alone." He smiled faintly, not denying it, but his eyes carried that restless weight of someone already moving on. He reached into his jacket and pressed a folded paper into her palm. His card, with nothing added but a handwritten line, "If you ever need a steady hand again." Then, with the same calm he had shown from the first night, he walked away. Nora stood watching until the crowd swallowed him. A pang of loss pressed in, but it did not crush her. Instead, she turned to Maya, who tugged her hand and asked if the sea lion's trip might still be possible one day. Nora knelt, brushing damp hair from her daughter's face, and whispered, "Yes, one day soon." That afternoon, she opened her notebook. The red ink bills were still there, stark as ever, but now, alongside them, she wrote names, numbers, and plans, a rota for community volunteers, a fundraiser idea for the school, a note to ask the cafe owner about expanding shifts. The ledger no longer felt like a record of failure, but a blueprint of beginnings. The town had survived, and so had she. More than that, she had discovered that resilience wasn't a lonely act. It was a web of hands, strangers and neighbors alike, holding fast together when the water rose. As the sun set golden over the harbor, Nora placed the beechwood cross back on the mantel of her modest home, not as a plea, but as a reminder. Whatever storms returned, she was no longer just bracing against them. She was part of something stronger, something that could endure, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe not only in survival, but in tomorrow. Your heart knows the way. Subscribe and follow the beauty.